This video is brought to you by Squarespace. A little over a year ago, I made a video called The Great British Class System Explained. We went through the upper class, the middle class, the working class. However, the truth is that understanding of the British class system is honestly a little bit out of date. Things have changed, right? There was a brand new update, season 2 released, which flipped the whole British class system on its head. Middle class uni graduates out of work claiming benefits, and millionaire working class plumbers arguing against taxing rich people.
I'm very disappointed. I think it's a disgraceful decision.
And of course, a quiet ruling class behind the scenes, pulling the strings whilst we all fight each other. This new class dynamic of Britain has really affected politics, as society becomes increasingly divided and radicalised. So, today we will explore Britain's new class war. Class is one of those concepts that are both really simple and confusing at the same time. On one hand, we understand class as like culture and behaviour, whether you pronounce your T's when you say Luton.
And I'm here today in Luton, voted the worst place to live in England.
Or whether you shop at Louis Vuitton or Primark. And that's all well and good, that's very interesting, but on the other hand, class is really about power and ownership. Do you control large swathes of land? Do you control factories? Do you control machinery? Do you even control the orcs in your Ford Fiesta? And these two things are connected, right? Culture and also power. And seemingly every civilization in history has always had some kind of class system. But the thing is, the class system is never rigid. It evolves and changes based on the power dynamics of that era. So for a very long time in European history, in the medieval era, class was split along what they would call the three estates. You would have the nobles at the top, the priests in the middle, and then the peasants at the bottom. But you see, time passed, right? And this system was getting a bit boring. The player counts were dropping. So around about the 17th to 18th century, we released a brand new DLC called the Enlightenment Era.
Don't murder or steal.
This new era completely flipped the class dynamics. Adam Smith, who's like, he's like Big Daddy capitalism. He was explaining that there was now a new hierarchy, a new class system where you had the land-owning aristocrats, you had the workers, but now you had the capitalists. But what was interesting is that the aristocrats and the capitalists, they weren't homies. Adam Smith himself, he despised landlords, right? He hated the aristocratic class because they made all of their wealth just simply by sitting back and taking rent from the workers that worked their land. Whereas the capitalists, they were the innovators, the risk takers, the wealth creators. And obviously the workers, yeah, they were doing the bitch work, but look, the capitalists were at least doing something. But this created a tension, right? Because the aristocrats, they were super like just up for chilling all the time. They really didn't like doing anything. They just liked vibing. And the capitalists were like, bros, that we could make machines that could make boats and we can fucking do cool stuff. Now, long story short, what happened was that this middle class of capitalists became wealthier than the aristocrats and eventually toppled them politically. And so, yeah, this class system, this rigid class system that had existed all throughout medieval Europe for hundreds and hundreds of years had now completely changed. The capitalists were now in charge. And so whilst all this history is unraveling before them, two bros by the name of Marx and Engels, they came to this conclusion that all of history, all of politics, is a continuing class struggle of different groups with different interests and their distance to the control of vital resources needed in an economy that creates these conflicts. And like these guys themselves were rich and smart, so they were using fancy French words to describe them. The bourgeoisie, basically rich people who owned the means of production, the factory and the machinery owners. And then you had the proletariat. These were your wage cucks, right? They just worked really hard jobs and all they had to make money was their labor. So they would sell their labor to the bourgeoisie. But you see, whilst Marx was analyzing this, these power dynamics, he noticed a very weird side character, just a little side piece. These lot weren't aristocratic lords, nor were they factory tycoons. But, very importantly, they weren't wage cucks either. No. These were the shopkeepers, the market traders, the artisan, the small business owners, the petty bourgeois. The petty bourgeois, right? These were a curious bunch. And eventually, they would end up becoming a very powerful political pawn. They were like a strange quirk of capitalism, right? Typically, these were people who grew up working class or came from working class families.
Front room. Could you just come round a bit close? Come closer, because at these prices I can't afford to deliver.
However, they had managed to amass some wealth, a little bit of money, just enough to open some kind of small business. Now, for the most part, if you were born working class, that was it. Like, you worked for an employer, they chucked you down a chimney, you came out and they gave you like 1 pence. What defined them as working class was the fact that they had no ability to generate wealth themselves. All they could do was sell their labor to some rich bro for a wage. That was it. That's the deal. But not the petty bourgeois. No, these boys were nimble. They would find a little gap in the market, slot themselves right in there. Sure, you might have big chains like Sainsbury's that dominate the high street. However, Sainsbury's was only open 9 till 5. It wasn't really worth them being open late. It wouldn't make enough money. But for Peter the petty bourgeois, this was his moment. What if I just don't sleep? We can stay open all night. And like, yeah, Peter might not have the resources and the scale of the big chains, but what he has is something these big chains will never. The grind set.
It's 3:30 right now on a Monday night. I've been staying up all night working my new business. A few months from now, when my business is taken off, I'm going to be chilling in Dubai.
By Peter, because he's the boss of himself, he can just work as long as he wants. Work long hours into the night, maybe rope the wife and kids in and not pay them any wages. And this was the game plan, right? You know, just find those little gaps in the market that weren't worth it for these big chains to do. And so you take Peter and you multiply him by hundreds of thousands and you get a nation full of shopkeepers. This is the book recommendation for this video, by the way. Very good book. Put an affiliate link below. Couldn't have made this without this book, so check it out. And what was particularly interesting about this class of people was their status, like their ranking in the hierarchy of society. Because they're obviously not in the capitalist elite, but equally they didn't really fit in the working class. But they kind of had traits of both. Like the working class, they too still had to exchange their labor for money. But like the capitalist elite, they owned the fruits of their labor. They owned the means of their production. They might have even employed people. They would have been a boss. And when it comes to their culture, depending on what it is they did, they might be selling to the working class. So they were interacting with them daily. They might speak the same type of language and exhibit the same behaviors as them. But what kind of separated most of them is that they aspired for more than the working class did. Arguably, they were a little bit higher status than the average working class person. And that may be true, but they didn't have the luxury of the rich who inherited everything. Nah, they had to work for what they got. So yeah, it was pretty lonely for the petty bourgeois, right? They existed in this lonely in-between, not quite existing in the same worlds as the working class, but never truly accepted in the world of the bourgeois. So what would come of these people? Before we go any further with this video, I want to give a massive shout out to today's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the #1 platform for building your own custom, beautiful, amazing website. For me, the best bit is the cutting edge design tools. By using their Blueprint AI, anyone can have a perfectly customized and bespoke website. You can just tell the AI what your industry is, what your goals are for the website, and it will create a personally designed website filled with content and an amazing looking design. And from their award-winning templates, you can just pick and choose any of the designs that you like and really make your website stand out. A massive part of businesses these days is having an email marketing list so that you can send out things like product updates and events, etc. Squarespace allows you to make them as well as managing them and sending them out. Literally any time in the past that I've needed to make a website, I've always used Squarespace. It's simple, easy to use, and enjoyable. So be sure to head to squarespace.com to start your free trial. And when you're ready to launch the website, go to squarespace.com/Jimmy the Giant to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. Anyway, back to the video. So when Marx talked about these people, he wrote them off that they were just going to disappear over time. He assumed that the corner shop will eventually get swallowed up by the supermarket and the small artisan tool maker will eventually get crushed by factories and automation. But you see, my friends, that is not what happened. Instead of the bros disappearing, the petty bourgeois just kept respawning. Every time capitalism got some new update, the petty bourgeois would just find a new meta, new cracks in the market where they could squeeze in. And not only did this class of people survive, they would actually go on to become one of the most important political pawns. They would actually go on to become one of the most important political pawns in history. Because you see, when everything heats up and shit hits the fan, the economy's crumbling, and the workers are starting to get pissed at the bosses, historically speaking, it's this middle group, this petty bourgeois, which can tip the scale. And there is nowhere on earth where that has been truer than in Britain. Right, so after the war, 1945, Britain's power structure is fundamentally changed. We designed the system to balance the powers of the working class and of big capital. The working class was backed by powerful unions and collective bargaining, and the wealthy class had to play ball with nationalization of certain industries, along with strict regulations of their own businesses and high taxes. And you would have the government there as like a referee on these two classes, who would manage the welfare state and plan these nationalized industries. And as well, there was the professional middle class, which we actually haven't talked about. So these were like the managers, the lawyers, the doctors, high skilled and very educated, so they earned good money. They would own homes and stuff like that. However, they were employed by big capital or the government in nationalized industries as well. They were workers, but they were obviously much wealthier than the working class. And then you had our bros, the petty bourgeois. They, in this time, still existed. These were the shopkeepers, the self-employed and the small business owners. And the post-war consensus period, this was a weird time for the petty bourgeois because they lived in like a twilight zone. You see, like life was improving for the working class. Their wages were rising, they had state guaranteed job security, and they had affordable council housing. And as well, the big businesses, they received protection from the government. They received subsidies. But the petty bourgeois, they had nothing. They were getting squeezed from both sides. Both the working class and the big capital were making life tough for them. The strong unions that protected the working class made it very expensive for petty bourgeois business owners to employ working class people. The high tax rates would eat into their profits. And equally, big capital was able to dominate markets. They could outcompete the petty bourgeois with supply chains, scale, and mass production. And also, they could directly lobby the government for preferential treatment. So if you think about like the artisan woodworker who might spend a week carving some perfect chair, he loved the quality of his products, he has to compete against the guy who owns a factory, who can just click a button and it'll shit out a chair. And it was a weird time for them because the morality or the consciousness of Britain was that of like a solidarity and a strong focus around workers, and equally of what is called one nation Tories or like paternal conservatism, the idea that the wealthy should look after the poor. And like whilst that was true and that was the morality of the time, after the war Britain was drastically changing. These working class people had more money to spend in the economy, meaning that small businesses could pop up and sell them stuff. And by the 50s, you even get this subculture called the mods, which basically was a subculture of just consumerists. These were young people with excess money spending it on clothes, mopeds, music records, etc. And so over time, this culture of like working class struggle was becoming less of a struggle, right? Things were improving. And so when the 70s would roll around and post-war Britain would collapse with oil shocks, strikes, 3-day work weeks, the Cold War, this balance of the past between these classes were getting out of hand. The state, the big capitalists, the working class unions were all at war with each other. And ever so quietly, as this war raged, the petty bourgeois, the small business owner, they were starting their own war, as they were struggling too, and no one was really giving a shit about them. They were facing high taxes, high regulation, but also because working class people weren't having enough money to spend due to the economic problems, they were facing a fall in consumer demand. Because of inflation, their supply chains were becoming more and more expensive. And unlike the big businesses, they didn't have the scale and the capital to survive these massive economic shocks. They weren't granted the protections from the government. And so there they were, trapped amongst this conflict between the unions, the state, and big businesses, with no one to represent them. Until...
Thank you. We believe you get a society which is responsible when you get people who are responsible.
Maggie Thatcher, she was different, right? Yeah, she was a Tory, but she wasn't an aristocrat. She didn't come from the industrial elite either. And she definitely wasn't a high-ranking union leader. No, Margaret Thatcher was the humble daughter of a grocer in Grantham. She knew what it was like to run a small business. She literally grew up stocking shelves, watching and helping her dad as he was balancing the books, making sure to not overspend, and eventually taking that wisdom all the way to number 10 Downing Street. She was a self-made girl boss. Sort of. I mean, she did marry like a really, really, really rich man, and a really, really well-funded think tank basically cooked her up and turned her into this politician. But don't worry, rags to riches. But yeah, this backstory to Thatcher, she played on it endlessly. And like, yeah, it was kind of petty bourgeois cosplay, but it was very convincing. And it was enough to make millions and millions of small go-getters believe that she's one of us. She gets it. And you can hear it in like the kind of things she would say. She would always bang on about,
There is no such thing as public money. There is only taxpayers' money.
this idea that your hard-earned tax is being wasted on these lazy bureaucrats and these welfare scroungers. She pushed the idea of like popular capitalism, which was her way of selling shares of private companies to ordinary people, turning everyone into a mini capitalist with their own portfolio. And most importantly, the right to buy. This was a policy that allowed tenants of council houses to buy their council house off of the government for a massively discounted rate. Home ownership being the hallmark of the middle class dream. And these discounted houses gave them the illusion of moving up in the world. Self-help, self-reliance, and personal responsibility. This was the moral worldview of every corner shop owner, of every one-man band builder going at it alone. And she really installed this attitude amongst the British people of like the strivers versus the skivers, which gave this moral framing that striving and fighting for your lot in life is morally noble. And people who didn't do that were below you. Those who had to rely on the state for work and for housing. These were these infantilized children suckling the teat of the state.
I believe that we were going towards a way of life in which people were constantly looking to the state to solve their problems and to do things for them.
Which, you know, if we compare this mentality to that of the post-war period, was considerably different, almost the opposite. But Thatcher's moral framework was speaking to a new type of Brit that was emerging in this post-war economic context. The idea that there is no such thing as society, is every man for themselves.
Some socialists seem to believe that people should be numbers in a state computer. We believe they should be individuals.
And her plan worked. Thatcher managed to turn a class that Marx thought was going to go extinct into an electoral army as she gave birth to what would be known as the Essex Man. The phrase Essex Man was first coined by Simon Heffer, who wrote in the Sunday Telegraph in the 90s about this new phenomena, the Essex Man, who was the archetype of Thatcher's success. The Essex Man was sort of described as this working class voter who had bought their council house, who owned a car, who felt proud of their own independence, who had deserted Labour in exchange for Margaret Thatcher. The Essex Man was someone who really believed in going after and getting it themselves, rather than relying on collectivism. Often the Essex Man was some kind of like tradesman, or maybe like a salesman. These are like your Del Boy characters. They were working class in origin. Usually they would be the child of a Labour voting industrial worker who was starting to do quite well and really liked when Mrs. Thatcher would talk about low taxes. They bought into the idea that the unions were dragging down the country, and they were very proud about the fact that they had risen in class and that they had made it. They now owned their own home, unlike their dad did. They were like the political defectors of the old Labour movement. But you see, by the 90s, right, Thatcher's no longer in power, but this archetype managed to live on. When Tony Blair and New Labour came around the 90s, they needed their own version. And so Tony Blair invented the Mondeo Man. The Mondeo Man was basically the Essex Man with a polished job. They were probably a bit more suburban, a bit more middle England, but maybe a little bit less brash, less Thatcherite, and less reactionary. And from here, right, this archetype would grow in significance.
Mondeo Man is being wooed by UKIP, and this week, should Rochester fall, they claim the purple tide could sweep the whole of North Kent.
So you might hear all that, think it's very interesting, but maybe you're wondering, how are they so significant? You know, between the 1980s to 2000s odd, the self-employed only made up about 12 to 14% of the population. How can they be so important politically? But this is the thing, right? The petty bourgeois are like the ultimate swing voter. Them boys can really go either way. And that's because they're a little bit insecure. right? On one half, they deeply fear sliding back into the working class, but equally, they're always dreaming to one day enter the elite class. This instability makes them very volatile, and you can never really assume which way they're going to vote. Historically, they sometimes swing to the left, demanding better worker protections, siding with the unions, even sometimes backing revolutions. But other times, they will swing to the right, reactionary, authoritarian, desperate to protect what little property they managed to get in life. And this isn't just theory, this is a pattern that does exist throughout history. I mean, in 1930s Germany, petty bourgeois were like a key part in Hitler's rise to power. Shopkeepers, clerks, small business owners and farmers, these were people who were terrified of losing their status during the Great Depression. And the Marxist left, they really didn't like the petty bourgeois. They called them the mass base of fascism because they would side with the Nazis against the organized working class. But equally, interestingly, also didn't like big capital, or like, a very specific subsect of Jewish big capital. So it meant that politically they worked to protect the interests of big capital, but it was really like a relationship of convenience. Scared that the organized working class will come for them, they would put their difference aside from the capitalist elite and kind of join forces. And it's this instability, the insecurity, that the ruling class has long known how to manipulate. This deep anxiety that many of the petty bourgeois have into falling back into the working class. And so when times are tough, the economy's tanking, their business is struggling, they will channel their resentment downward toward migrants, toward welfare claimants, towards unions demanding better worker protections, rather than upward towards those who are hoarding the wealth. They can be coerced by the ruling class to be like, hey, look, guys, you're one of us. What's that? You own a little corner shop? Man, I get it. Yeah, it's tough, right? I own Sainsbury's. But in reality, though, the petty bourgeois are like these in-betweeners, fucked from both sides. Like if a government wants to raise taxes on the wealthy, the politicians can make special carve-outs and schemes so that the very wealthy can avoid it, but the small business owner is the least mobile. They can't tax avoid like someone who can afford to open a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Politicians might do something like taxing second homes, which kills private landlords, but it probably won't affect the big developers and the corporate landlords who, they'll find a way to restructure the ownership through shell companies or do massive bulk purchase deals, and somehow they'll find a way to sidestep the tax. But it's exactly this reason why they're so useful politically, because they don't have the organized collective power that the working class can have, nor do they have the lobbying powers or protections that the elite wealthy class has. And so they can often be loud, angry, and motivated by the fear of losing what little that they have achieved, so they can become instrumental in things like Thatcher smashing the unions, or cutting the welfare state and cutting taxes for the rich. So it'd be in the 2000s, right, where the perception of the petty bourgeois would change once again. And this was as the tabloid coined the new phrase, the white van man.
In the hunt for new customers, Britain's white van men are entering uncharted waters.
This phrase was first used in 1997. It was later popularized by The Sun and Top Gear, and it was slightly more of a negative than the Mondeo man. Often it was used to describe like a self-employed builder or plumber, or, a delivery man in his van who is loud, opinionated, entrepreneurial, and often very politically reactionary.
My big question tonight, why is this tweet, which I thought looked completely harmless when I first saw it, responsible for the biggest political scandal in Britain today?
The white van man was the new reskin, and they were less about Thatcher's aspirational dream and more about like cultural grievance, Euroscepticism, political correctness gone mad. And this is because of New Labour, right? Which is this weird mishmash of politics called the third way, where you have a movement of people who are like socially progressive. It might champion women's rights, gay marriage, etc. But economically, they're very much similar to Thatcher. Big business, growth, free market, etc. So the white van man was portrayed as being sort of stuck in the past. It was the kind of voter who might have supported UKIP, who might have voted for Brexit, who then might have voted for Boris Johnson, and now supports Nigel Farage and Reform. And so this class of people, right, they've gone up and down in public opinion many times, is in some ways kind of running the show right now politically, or at least having heavy influence. So many of this group can speak with a working class accent. But when I say a working class accent, I mean the classic Cockney geezer working class accent.
My name is Turkish. Funny name for an Englishman, I know.
This accent is sort of archetypal to the old understanding of the British working class. But you got to remember, as a significant amount of these people did well for themselves financially, many of them ended up moving away from those working class towns that they grew up in, making enough money to buy some, fancy gaff in a town called Wiggleswood. And what this did, right, this movement of like the traditional white working class Brit out from those original towns, well, it left both an economic and cultural hole in the modern British working class. That class actually started to move away from those types of jobs. Often they would stay in the trades industry. However, they very often became much more specialized. Many trained to become like self-employed electricians, plumbers, who had to go through qualifications and get trained. They had moved away from carrying bricks around a construction site. Now they were installing underfloor heating, complex wiring, opening their own construction companies. And as demand grew for more and more specialized building and trade skills, these lot could demand higher and higher salaries. And so as they moved into these jobs, this hole ended up being eventually filled by the newly emerging multicultural British working class. This meant that increasingly, the classic Cockney geezer London working class accent, the same accent that in the past was associated with football hooliganism and the Sun, increasingly is associated with BMW driving plasterers with a buy-to-let on the side.
When I sold the company was, in 2021, it was about 140 odd mil, and it sounds a lot of money, and no doubt it is, but I've been spending it on celebrating and enjoying life, really. I've had, some amazing holidays in Dubai and staying in the Al Burj Arab, which is about 125 grand, for a few weeks. Rolls Royces, Bentleys, private jets, flying backwards and forwards. And then property, but I probably thinking back on it, I would say the best thing that I've spent my money on over the years was this penthouse flat that I have on the river.
But what I find really interesting is their relationship to the traditional British middle class and how the British middle class looks down on this sort of petty bourgeois sometimes. Much in the very same way that the old aristocratic classes would look down on the capitalists and the industrialists, even when the industrialists were starting to do better than the aristocrats.
I've seen some of my friends who I felt I was on a level and same plane as, disappear over the last few years. So I feel that a lot of the people in my level of the middle class, there is no promotion to go to. The ones that went up were mainly in banking, and I'm actually being paid less than I was 10 years ago.
All right, so think about the classic middle class route in life. Go to a decent school in a safe area, then you go to university, get a degree, land a good white-collar job in your dad's company, and then you eventually climb the ladder and you get a very comfortable lifestyle. This route, right, the university into office job, this was the route that they were told to do, the middle class, and also, increasingly, kids of working class parents. However, this deal recently has started to break down. Firstly, wages since the financial crash just flatlined. They stopped growing. All whilst inflation and house prices just fucking shot up. Owning a home, which was the ultimate badge of middle classery, has become borderline impossible for many young, educated professionals who work office jobs. On top of that, debt has exploded. Whilst middle-class kids' parents would have bought their house in their 20s, the modern middle class has racked up thousands and thousands in student debt just to get a degree, then to go and shell half of their wages out on rent every single month. And this trend is pretty mad because my generation are one of the most educated generations ever. A historic 50% of young people achieved first entry into higher education in 2017. But the graduate wage premium, like the expected amount more money you should make because you have a degree, is falling. And that's because there are loads of educated graduates who are all chasing a very limited pool of graduate jobs in this country. That competition drives wages down and forces many into underemployment. Meanwhile, on the opposite side, trades like plumbing, electrical work, construction work, these careers face chronic labor shortages. We never have enough people to fill them. And all you need to do is go and get a qualification. It's hard, but you can do it. And once you've got the qualification, the competition for work is way smaller and the pay can be very high. So right now we're in this bizarre inversion of the past where very often the specialized plumber, electrician can sometimes out-earn the graduate office workers. Whilst the graduate probably has a much higher ceiling of potential earnings, the competition to get there is much higher. Arguably, the tradesman can probably secure a higher paying job quicker, all whilst having started work earlier. They could start as early as 18 and don't have the weight of student debt. In other words, what I'm trying to say is the cultural middle class, the uni-educated, white-collared professional, their status in society is declining, whereas the geezer on the tools, his status is climbing.
There's no easy way to say this. We made a pledge, we didn't stick to it, and for that I am sorry.
And what is really interesting is that these two groups of people, politically, can very often be put at war with one another.
We are the party that will make massive cuts to welfare. If we don't, well, what is coming down the track will best part bankrupt us, although some might say we're almost there.
Some people call these young middle-class grads like champagne socialists. It's meant to be an insult to say they're sort of pretending to care about workers' rights or something like that. But I mean, really, I think it's just the fact that middle-class people are increasingly faced with exploitative and underpaying working environments. And so their politics tends to reflect that reality. And they can be very politically discontent because they were told from a young age that if they go and get educated, they'll go get a job and own a house. But when they did all that and their realities didn't meet the promises that society fucking told them, many can then conclude that the system is fundamentally flawed and they seek political alternatives.
So can university really said to still be worth it? Every job you apply for says no, because there are 140 applicants per graduate job now. You're lucky if you even get an email to acknowledge that you've applied, let alone to say no. The fact of saying no is borne out by not receiving an email back from the people you applied to 4 months ago.
But then on the flip side, it creates an interesting political tension as we increasingly see the rise of far-right political parties. Parties like Reform, who tend to position themselves as the sort of voice of the working class, but their policies don't reflect that. They will typically be in favour of tax cuts for the rich, cutting public spending, and reducing the welfare state. They also tend to vote against increased workers' rights. Things like zero-hour contracts they tend to be in favour of, which of course is against the genuine economic working class. Like, workers want those things, typically. So this begs the question, who do they mean when they say working class? Well, I think it's this strange coalition of different groups, one of which being these sort of more petty bourgeois, working class type small business owners. You can see this in a person like Charlie Mullins. He's a perfect example.
I'm a normal sort of working class person, come from nothing. It's a long struggle, and you know, businesses are not an overnight success.
But always argues against taxing rich people because he is rich people.
What she's doing now is atrocious. She's talking about someone with a £500,000 house, which is nothing in London. It's like a one-bedroom apartment. Yep. How does she think these people got them? You know, they're working class people.
And also you can see this in Tommy Robinson. I mean, just purely based on economics, he is a multi-millionaire himself. But he appeals to this sort of classic working class culturally because of his accent and demeanor. But I think it's really important to distinguish the difference between the economic working class and then the cultural working class. Because as I just laid out, those things have fundamentally changed. As the modern economic working class isn't that sort of Cockney geezer as much anymore. It's now made up of a mixture of white Brits, multicultural Brits, immigrants, and increasingly the postgraduate struggling middle class kids. Now with that though, there is a key nuance to make, that of course there is still a large white British, classically working class who have not managed to ascend into this sort of petty bourgeois, well-off type person. There's loads of them that still haven't. You'll find these types of Brits often in sort of post-industrial towns that are now in decline. These people are not well off and they're not doing well and they face all of the same economic problems. And this group, the sort of left behind white British working class, they are very much subject to a political tug of war. The socialists will try and appeal to them over their dislike for, you know, exploitative working conditions, unstable jobs, lack of jobs, and underinvestment into their towns.
Are we going to have a country that is run for corporations, where our public services, our education system, our NHS, and our housing are used as investment opportunities for the super rich? Or are we going to have a country that's run for the people in it? And I say, we have got to have a country that's run for the people in it.
whereas the populist far right will tend to go after them over concerns for immigration. And although these towns can sometimes be like 95% white, they might have seen increased immigration over the last sort of 20 years, and politicians will tell them that the immigrants are straining your NHS, your schools, your council houses, which as we know is obviously due to underinvestment from the government, but they often can make a very useful scapegoat to blame economic problems on. And as well, these parties will try to appeal to a more nationalistic cultural identity, telling them that British culture is in decline and under attack. And it's interesting then what comes of that, right? Because you have these people, these communities that are really struggling, who then get weaponized as enemies of the middle class graduate types, because the middle class graduate tends to be more socially progressive, pro-immigration, pro-LGBT, pro-trans, etc. Despite the fact that just logically, if these groups teamed up, it'd be much better for them. They are deliberately pitted against each other by politicians and political influences. And to be clear, I am talking in massive generalizations. There will of course exist many exceptions to these blocks, but these are sort of general trends you'll find. So now, as these culture wars of divisions rage, there is one final, newly emerging class in the Great British class system that is growing and growing and basically breaks down all of the conventions of the original system, and that is the precariat. So if on one side you have the classic self-employed striver, the plumber on 70k, where do we slot in Deliveroo drivers, Uber drivers, Amazon delivery drivers? These lot often are self-employed. They receive no worker protections, no unionization, no sick pay. They're self-employed, but sort of in name only. Like if the traditional definition of the word bourgeois is the owner of the means of production, can we really say that owning a bike is owning the means of production? It's a bit of a stretch. Economically and materially, he is a very precarious worker. He or she has to rely on tech platforms for work. And every job that they do, they have to pay that platform a small percentage. Sociologists define these people as the precariat because of the insecurity and precariousness of their whole entire lives. They work on temporary contracts, 0-hour gigs, they live in rented accommodation, and are basically living in endless flexibility, which is a sort of cute word for instability. They're not workers in the old sense. They have no worker protections, but equally they're not bosses either. They permanently live on the edge.
Uber calls its drivers partners, independent operators who partner up with the tech firm. Uber claimed it's a technology company, not a taxi firm, but the Employment Tribunal dismissed the company's arguments and suggested the firm had tried to bamboozle its drivers with twisted language.
And unlike, you know, the traditional petty bourgeois who tend to move into self-employment because they want freedom, they want to be in control of their own lives, etc., the precariat aren't sort of aspirational like that. They're just pushed into self-employment due to a lack of stable jobs. So you end up in this strange situation whereby the British class system makes less and less sense every single day. And politically, this breakdown of the class system and the instability of it and the many divisions it causes is political gold for the ruling class, because these endless divisions allow for the ruling class to pit everyone against each other. All whilst, in reality, all of them are actually just in the same boat. Insecure, squeezed, shut out of real wealth and power. And instead of these groups uniting politically, they're kept divided politically, fed a diet of culture wars, rage and scapegoats, as well as condemnation and judgment. All whilst the ruling class, the billionaires, the offshore wealth, operate quietly in the background above it all, doing better than they have ever done historically and are more secure than they've ever been ever. So, with all that doom and gloom, right, is there anything we can do about it? Well, it's hard, right? Because the media always fills us with these stories that really obviously pit us against each other. But you have to just understand that these divisions are theatre, ultimately. They're only politically useful for people at the top. Because whether you're, a uni student saddled with 60 grand's worth of debt, a Deliveroo driver with no sick pay, or a tradesman who's getting hammered by the HMRC, whilst billionaires are able to avoid paying tax, you are all in the exact same struggle, being squeezed by the exact same system. So we have to try and reach people and unify on economic issues. And we are seeing this is cutting through. I mean, you guys are all aware of Gary's economics, and increasingly Zach Polansky of the Green Party, go join the Greens if you haven't, he is also starting to cut through, and it is working. And I think we just have to keep talking about inequality. Whether it's just you talking to your friends in the pub, sending videos to your parents who might not have heard some of this stuff, or if you want to be a content creator, go out and showcase wealth inequality. Go to rich areas, show how people are living right now. Go to Mayfair, go to South Kensington, go to fucking anywhere in the southeast that votes Tory. We need to show and educate people using new media and using our voices. Class really isn't about accents, tastes, and culture. It is about power. Who has it and who doesn't?
I managed to start changing the funding formulas to make sure that areas like this are getting the funding that they deserve. Because we inherited a bunch of formulas from the Labour Party that shoved all the funding into deprived urban areas. You know, that needed to be undone.
The petty bourgeois were never meant to survive, but also the middle class weren't meant to disappear. Yet here we are in Britain's new class war. And the only way for us to win it is to recognise it and to cut through all of this culture war noise, to fight together to improve all of our lives and not against each other. If you enjoy this video, make sure to go support me on Patreon. It massively helps me support the work I'm doing here. It helps me to pay my editors better, so I'll link that below. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.